The moment Patricia Montgomery's words sliced through the air at the Rosewood Country Club's Sunday brunch, I knew my marriage had just been publicly executed. We were sitting at the premium terrace table overlooking the 18th hole, surrounded by white tablecloths, crystal champagne flutes, and the kind of people who measured their worth by the weight of their jewelry. I thought we were celebrating Marcus's promotion to senior partner at his law firm. Turns out, I was the only one who didn't know this brunch was actually an intervention designed to put me in my place. You're just the maid who happens to sleep with my son, dear. Know your place. Patricia's voice carried that particular blend of honey and arsenic that only women born into old money seem to master. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She was too busy adjusting the Cartier bracelet on her wrist, the one I'd spent 3 weeks researching and 2 hours gift wrapping for her last birthday. The entire table fell silent. Marcus's sister Vanessa actually smiled into her mimosa. His father Richard cleared his throat and suddenly became fascinated with the golf course. And Marcus, my husband of 3 years, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, just sat there frozen like a deer in headlights. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. The worst part was the knowing looks exchanged between family members, the subtle nods, the way Patricia's sister Caroline murmured, "Well." Someone had to say it, just loud enough for me to hear. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of cruelty. This was a coordinated strike, carefully planned and perfectly executed at a public venue where they assumed I'd be too mortified to cause a scene. They'd underestimated me, but let me back up, because you need to understand how I ended up at that table in the first place, wearing a designer dress I couldn't afford, serving mimosas to people who'd spent 3 years treating me like their personal assistant. My name is Rachel Torres, and I met Marcus Montgomery at a legal conference in Chicago 4 years ago. I was a junior corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm, working 80-hour weeks and living in a studio apartment that cost more than my car. Marcus was already a rising star at Montgomery Associates, the prestigious firm his grandfather founded in 1952. Yes, that Montgomery Associates. The one with offices in 12 cities and clients whose names you'd recognize from Forbes covers. I'd like to say it was love at first sight, but honestly, it was more like exhaustion at first sight. We were both trapped in the hotel bar after a particularly grueling day of seminars, and we started bonding over overpriced scotch and complaints about billable hours. Marcus was different from the other legacy lawyers I'd met. He was self-deprecating, funny, and seemingly aware of his privileged background. He made jokes about his mother's obsession with social standing and his sister's designer shopping addiction. He called himself the black sheep of the family because he actually worked for his position instead of just coasting on the family name. I should have paid more attention to the fact that he was still working at his family's firm. I should have noticed that for all his jokes about their pretensions, he still showed up to every family dinner, still deferred to his father's opinions, still called his mother every single day. But I was 28, lonely, and foolishly believing that love could bridge any gap, including the chasm between his family's old money and my parents' working-class roots. My father was a mechanic who owned a small auto shop in Queens. My mother was a nurse who worked double shifts to help pay for my college education. I got into Columbia Law on a combination of scholarships, loans, and sheer stubborn determination to prove that poor kids from immigrant families could make it in the world of corporate law. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, passed the bar on my first try, and worked my way up from document review to actual client meetings. Everything I had, I'd earned. And that, as I would discover, was exactly what the Montgomery family held against me. The first time I met Patricia Montgomery, I was wearing my best interview suit and carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I wanted to admit. Marcus had warned me that his mother could be particular about things, which I later learned was wealthy people code for impossibly demanding and judgmental. We were having dinner at the Montgomery estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling property that made my entire childhood apartment building look like a garden shed. Patricia had greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that said, "I'm going to be polite to you," while silently cataloging every single thing that's wrong with you. The dinner had been a minefield of subtle tests I didn't even know I was taking. Patricia had commented on my accent, asking where I was originally from, in that tone that suggested she was really asking what country my family had emigrated from and when. She'd inquired about my parents' professions with barely concealed disdain when I mentioned the auto shop and the hospital. She'd asked which prep school I'd attended, then made a sympathetic noise when I explained I'd gone to public school. Every answer I gave seemed to confirm some pre-existing bias she held about people who hadn't been born into the right zip code, but the real test had come when she'd asked me to help her bring dessert in from the kitchen. I'd thought it was a kind gesture, a chance for us to bond privately. Instead, it was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 3 years of my life. As soon as we were alone, Patricia had transformed from politely condescending hostess to drill sergeant, rattling off instructions about how the dessert should be plated, where the coffee cups needed to go, which spoons were appropriate for which courses. She'd criticized the way I held the dessert plates, corrected my posture, and actually rearranged the fruit garnish I'd carefully placed on each serving. "Marcus needs someone who understands how to properly manage a household," she'd said, not looking at me as she adjusted a strawberry by exactly 1 millimeter. "His career is going to require a lot of entertaining, a lot of social obligations. I do hope you're prepared for that kind of responsibility." The implication was crystal clear. I wasn't being evaluated as a potential daughter-in-law. I was being interviewed for a position as household manager with benefits. I should have run then. I should have told Marcus that his mother was a nightmare and that I wasn't interested in auditioning for the role of domestic servant. But Marcus had been so apologetic afterward, so embarrassed by his mother's behavior. He'd promised that she'd warm up once she got to know me better, that she was just protective because he was her only son, that things would get easier after we were married. Every red flag I saw, he painted over with reassurances and promises that tomorrow would be better than today. The engagement had been another production entirely. Marcus had proposed on a weekend trip to Napa Valley, getting down on one knee at sunset with a 3-carat diamond ring that had been in his family for 4 generations. It was beautiful and romantic and completely orchestrated by Patricia, as I would later discover. She'd chosen the location, selected the ring, and even approved the restaurant where we celebrated afterward. Marcus had thought he was being traditional by including his mother in the planning. I'd felt like I was being absorbed into a collective that had already decided my role before I'd even said yes. The wedding planning had been where the real battle lines were drawn. Patricia had opinions about everything. The venue wasn't appropriate unless it was the country club where she'd been married. The guest list needed to include her entire social circle, even though Marcus and I barely knew most of them. The flowers, the music, the menu, the seating arrangements, everything required her approval. When I'd suggested involving my own mother in some of the decisions, Patricia had smiled that terrifying smile and said, "Oh, how sweet. But I'm sure your mother doesn't have experience with events of this scale." The unspoken message being that my mother, who'd successfully raised 3 children on a nurse's salary, wasn't qualified to plan a party for rich people. I tried to push back. Really, I had. I'd insisted on having my best friend Sophia as my maid of honor instead of Vanessa, Marcus's sister. I demanded that my father walk me down the aisle even though Patricia had suggested that Richard do it, since he's paying for everything. I'd chosen a dress I actually liked instead of the one Patricia had picked out. These small victories had felt significant at the time, little acts of independence that proved I wasn't going to be completely steamrolled. Looking back, I realized they were meaningless tokens, consolation prizes that distracted me from the fact that I was losing the actual war. The wedding itself had been beautiful in that sterile, magazine-perfect way that has nothing to do with the actual people getting married. 300 guests I mostly didn't know, sitting in a country club I'd never been able to afford on my own, eating food I hadn't chosen, listening to music I hadn't selected. Patricia had given a toast that made me sound like a charity case Marcus had graciously rescued from poverty. "We're so thrilled to welcome Rachel into our family," she'd said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "She may not have grown up with our advantages, but we know she'll work very hard to learn our ways." The emphasis on "work very hard" hadn't been accidental. She was already setting expectations for my future role. The honeymoon in Bora Bora had been the last time Marcus and I had felt like an actual couple rather than supporting characters in the Montgomery family drama. We'd spent 2 weeks disconnected from email and family obligations, just being two people who loved each other and wanted to build a life together. Marcus had talked about eventually leaving his family's firm and starting his own practice, maybe something focused on civil rights or public interest law, cases that actually mattered instead of just making rich people richer. I'd shared my dreams of making partner at my firm, of mentoring young lawyers from backgrounds like mine, of proving that you didn't need to be born into privilege to succeed in corporate law. We'd made plans, real plans, for a future that belonged to us instead of to the Montgomery family expectations. We'd talked about waiting a few years before having kids, about traveling more, about buying a smaller house in the city instead of moving to the suburbs where all of Marcus's relatives lived. For 2 perfect weeks, I believed that we were actually partners in this marriage, two equal people making decisions together about our shared future. I'd been spectacularly naive. The reality had crashed down on us the moment we returned home. Patricia had, helpfully, unpacked all our wedding gifts while we were gone, arranging them in our new apartment according to her preferences. She'd also taken the liberty of signing us up for membership at the country club, enrolling us in her charity organization, and committing us to hosting the monthly family dinner that upcoming Sunday. When I'd politely suggested that we might want to settle in first before taking on social obligations, Patricia had looked at me like I'd suggested burning down an orphanage. "Rachel, dear, you're a Montgomery now," she'd said, in that patient tone usually reserved for explaining things to small children. "We have certain responsibilities to our community and our family. I'm sure you want to make a good impression." The threat was implicit but clear. Step out of line and face social exile. Refuse to play along and watch your husband choose his family over you. I'd looked at Marcus, silently pleading for him to back me up, to tell his mother that we needed time alone to start our marriage. But Marcus had just nodded along, already pulling out his phone to check his calendar for the family dinner. That first Sunday dinner had set the template for the next 3 years of my life. I'd spent the entire day shopping for groceries, cleaning our apartment, and cooking a 5-course meal that Patricia had specifically requested. Marcus had been at the office until 6, leaving me to do all the preparation alone. His family had arrived promptly at 7, immediately beginning their inspection of our home and my hosting abilities. Patricia had commented on the dust on the bookshelf, the way I'd folded the napkins, and the temperature of the soup. Richard had criticized the wine selection. Vanessa had made passive-aggressive remarks about the mismatched serving dishes, comparing them unfavorably to her own Wedgwood collection, and Marcus had sat at the head of the table, playing the gracious host while I ran back and forth from the kitchen, serving course after course, refilling drinks, clearing plates. When I'd finally sat down to eat my own meal, already cold, Patricia had asked for coffee and dessert. Nobody had offered to help. Nobody had suggested that maybe the person who'd cooked the entire meal deserved a moment to rest. I was the maid who slept with the host, and everyone at that table except me seemed to understand that was my permanent position in this family. The pattern had repeated every single week for 3 years. Sunday dinner at our place, with me doing all the shopping, cooking, serving, and cleaning. Marcus would help with dishes sometimes, but only after his family had left and only if I specifically asked. More often, he'd retreat to his study to catch up on work while I scrubbed pots and washed wine glasses until midnight. When I tried to suggest that maybe we could alternate hosting duties with Vanessa or order catering occasionally, Patricia had looked horrified at the suggestion. "But you're so good at it, Rachel," she'd said, in a tone that made it clear this was a command rather than a compliment. "And besides, Vanessa is so busy with her charity work. We wouldn't want to burden her with hosting duties." Vanessa's charity work consisted of sitting on the board of her mother's foundation, attending luncheons, and occasionally writing checks. I was working 60-hour weeks at my firm, but apparently my time was less valuable because I was being paid for it. The family obligations had expanded far beyond Sunday dinners. There were birthday parties to plan, holiday events to coordinate, family reunions to organize. And somehow, every single one of these responsibilities had fallen to me. When it was Patricia's birthday, I was the one researching gifts, coordinating with her friends, booking restaurants, arranging flowers. When Richard wanted to celebrate a business milestone, I was planning the party, managing the guest list, selecting the venue. When Vanessa's twins were born, I was organizing the baby shower, setting up the nursery, and apparently serving as the family's on-call babysitter whenever Vanessa needed a break. I tried to set boundaries, honestly I had. I'd explained to Marcus that I had my own career, my own obligations, my own life beyond serving his family's endless needs. But every time I pushed back, Patricia would make some comment about how disappointed she was that I didn't seem to value family the way the Montgomerys did. Or Vanessa would make a snide remark about career women who were too selfish to help their relatives. Or Richard would deliver some speech about how in their family, everyone contributed to the collective good. The message was always the same: real Montgomery wives put family first, and if I wasn't willing to do that, maybe I wasn't really Montgomery material. The worst part was watching Marcus gradually transform from the man I'd married into a carbon copy of his father. In private, he'd acknowledge that his mother was demanding and his sister was spoiled. He'd agree that the family obligations were excessive and that we needed better boundaries. But the moment we were around the Montgomerys, he became a different person. He'd defer to his mother's opinions, laugh at his father's dismissive comments about my career, and silently watch as I was transformed into the family servant. When I'd confront him later about his failure to defend me, he'd claim he hadn't noticed anything wrong or that I was being too sensitive about his family's, joking around. My own career had started suffering under the weight of Montgomery family obligations. I was arriving late to work after staying up until 2 a.m. preparing for family events. I was missing important client meetings because Patricia had emergencies that required my immediate attention, emergencies that usually turned out to be minor social crises like the caterer canceling for one of her luncheons. I was turning down opportunities for advancement because the Montgomerys had already filled my calendar with their events and expectations. My boss at the firm, Margaret Chen, had pulled me aside about 6 months into my marriage to ask if everything was okay. She'd noticed my performance slipping, my focus wavering, my usual sharp attention to detail becoming increasingly scattered. I'd tried to explain about the family obligations, about the constant demands on my time and energy. Margaret had listened with growing concern, then asked me a question that I hadn't been able to answer. "Rachel, when was the last time you did something just for yourself? Something that had nothing to do with work or your husband's family?" I'd sat there in her office, trying to remember, and realized I couldn't. Every moment of my life had been consumed by either my job or my marriage, and increasingly, the marriage was winning that battle. Margaret had given me some advice that I hadn't wanted to hear at the time. She'd told me that successful partnerships, whether in law or in life, required equal contribution and mutual respect. She'd pointed out that from what I described, I was doing all the contributing while Marcus's family did all the taking. She'd suggested, very carefully, that I needed to either renegotiate the terms of my relationship or accept that I was going to spend the rest of my life as the Montgomery family's unpaid staff member. I'd thanked her for her concern and promised to think about it, then promptly buried her words under a mountain of denial and desperate hope that things would somehow improve on their own. But things hadn't improved. They'd gotten progressively worse as the Montgomery family's expectations expanded and my resistance crumbled under the constant pressure to conform. The family dinners had evolved from weekly events to twice-weekly obligations when Patricia decided that Wednesdays needed a family meal as well. The holiday planning had expanded from just Christmas and Thanksgiving to include every minor celebration on the calendar. I was suddenly responsible for coordinating Valentine's Day brunches, Easter egg hunts, 4th of July barbecues, Halloween parties, and anniversary celebrations for various Montgomery relatives I'd barely met. "It's for charity, Rachel," he'd said, as if that explained everything. "Mom is asking you to help with important causes. Don't you think that's more meaningful than just focusing on corporate law all the time?" The implication being that my career, the one I'd worked my entire life to build, was somehow less valuable than serving tea at his mother's fundraising luncheons. I'd wanted to scream at him that Patricia's charity work was mostly about social networking and tax deductions, that the actual people in need would be much better served by cash donations rather than my unpaid labor, that I had my own values and causes I cared about that had nothing to do with impressing his mother's country club friends. But I'd swallowed all those words and just nodded, adding another obligation to my already crushing schedule. The breaking point had started building about 6 months before that catastrophic brunch. Marcus had been promoted to senior partner at his family's firm, a position that surprised absolutely nobody since his last name was literally on the building. But Patricia had insisted on celebrating with a massive party, and naturally, I'd been put in charge of planning it. We're talking 200 guests, a live band, a 5-course dinner, custom cocktails, elaborate floral arrangements, and a video presentation of Marcus's career highlights that I'd had to compile from 15 years of family photos and professional achievements. I'd spent 3 months planning that party. 3 months of my life that I would never get back, dedicated to celebrating my husband's inherited success while my own career continued its slow decline into irrelevance. I'd coordinated with vendors, managed RSVPs, designed invitations, selected the menu, approved the decorations, and basically functioned as a professional event planner except without the professional part where I got paid for my expertise and labor. Patricia had been involved, of course, but her involvement had consisted primarily of criticizing my choices and demanding endless revisions to details that nobody else would notice or care about. The party itself had been a massive success. At least according to the Montgomery family standards. Everyone had complimented the food, the music, the ambience, the perfectly coordinated color scheme. Marcus had given a speech thanking his family for their support and his colleagues for their partnership. He'd mentioned me almost as an afterthought, referring to me as my lovely wife Rachel, without any acknowledgement of the hundreds of hours I'd spent making his celebration perfect. Patricia had been praised repeatedly for organizing such a wonderful event, and she'd accepted the compliments with gracious modesty, never once mentioning that I'd done literally everything except show up and take credit. I'd spent that entire evening smiling and nodding and playing the role of the proud wife while inside I was screaming at the injustice of it all. I'd watched Marcus bask in the glow of his family's approval while I remained invisible, just another piece of furniture in the Montgomery family's carefully curated life. And the worst part was that I couldn't even be angry about it because I'd agreed to all of it. Every decision to plan another event, every choice to prioritize Marcus's family over my own needs, every moment of silence when I should have been speaking up for myself, all of it had been my decision. I'd built this prison one compromise at a time, and now I was locked inside it. The day after the party, I'd been exhausted, depleted, running on fumes and spite. I'd called in sick to work, something I almost never did. And spent the entire day in bed alternating between sleep and crying. Marcus had left early for the office, riding high on his promotion and apparently oblivious to my complete emotional collapse. He'd kissed me on the forehead and told me to rest, then disappeared into his successful, validated life while I lay there wondering where mine had gone. That's when I'd started keeping track. I'd opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and begun documenting every single thing I did for the Montgomery family. Every Sunday dinner, with an estimated time investment and cost of ingredients. Every party planned, with hours spent on preparation. Every gift I'd researched, purchased, and wrapped. Every event I'd attended. Every obligation I'd fulfilled, every moment I'd spent serving a family that treated me like hired help. The numbers had been staggering. Over 3 years, I'd invested approximately 2,847 hours in unpaid labor for the Montgomery family. That was 118 complete days, almost 4 solid months of my life, dedicated to serving people who'd never once thanked me or acknowledged my contribution. I'd also calculated the monetary value of that labor. If I'd been paid as a professional event planner, personal assistant, and household manager at standard industry rates, I'd have earned approximately $85,000 over those 3 years. $85,000 in unpaid labor, not counting the career opportunities I'd missed. The promotions I hadn't pursued, the professional development I'd sacrificed to make sure Patricia's charity luncheons had the right flower arrangements. I'd been providing free services to people who could absolutely afford to pay for them, subsidizing their lifestyle with my time and energy while my own career and identity slowly dissolved. But the most damaging discovery hadn't come from my spreadsheet. It had come from an accidentally unlocked phone. I'd been using Marcus's iPad to look up a recipe for one of the endless family dinners when a notification had popped up from a family group chat I didn't know existed. The preview had shown Vanessa's message, is the help going to remember to pick up mom's prescription this time, or do I need to do everything myself? The help. They had a family group chat where they referred to me as the help. My hands had been shaking as I opened the full conversation. 3 years of messages, thousands of texts between Marcus, his parents, his sister, and occasionally his Aunt Caroline. And throughout all of it, running like a toxic thread, were references to me as the help, Rachel the assistant, Marcus's maid, and my personal favorite, the woman we're paying with room and board. They joked about my public school education, mocked my parents' working-class jobs, and placed bets on how long I'd last before realizing she's out of her depth, but Marcus had been the worst betrayer of all. I'd scrolled through his messages with growing horror and heartbreak. Watching my husband participate in the mockery of his own wife. When Vanessa had complained about me forgetting to pick up dry cleaning for one of Patricia's events, Marcus had responded, "What do you expect? She's not exactly trained for this kind of thing." When Patricia had criticized the appetizers I'd made for a family party, Marcus had agreed, "Yeah, she tries hard but doesn't quite have the touch, does she?" When Richard had questioned whether I was really Montgomery material, Marcus had promised, "She's learning. Give her time to adjust to our standards, our standards." As if I was a new employee on probation rather than his wife and supposed equal partner. I'd sat there in our living room, reading message after message, watching my marriage dissolve into a carefully maintained illusion. Marcus didn't defend me in private any more than he did in public. He was just better at hiding his true feelings when I was in the room. The man I'd married, the man who'd promised to love and honor me, had been actively participating in his family's campaign to reduce me to servant status. And he'd never once had the decency to be honest about it. I'd confronted him that night, iPad in hand, with 3 years of evidence of his betrayal displayed in blue and gray text bubbles. Marcus had gone pale, then red, then tried to convince me I was taking everything out of context. "It's just family banter. Rachel," he'd said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. "You know how my mom can be. Sometimes it's easier just to agree with her than to start a fight." But it wasn't just his mother. It was him. Every dismissive comment, every shared joke at my expense, every casual agreement that I wasn't quite good enough for the Montgomery standards, all of it had come from his own keyboard, his own thoughts, his own fundamental lack of respect for the woman he'd promised to cherish. We'd fought for hours that night. I'd shown him my spreadsheet, the documentation of all my unpaid labor, the calculation of how much his family had taken from me while giving nothing back. I'd pointed out how my career had suffered, how my identity had been eroded, how I'd become invisible in my own life. Marcus had tried every defense in the book. I was being dramatic. I was taking things too seriously. His family loved me and just had high standards. I was letting feminist ideology poison a perfectly good marriage. That last one had actually made me laugh, a bitter, broken sound that scared both of us. "Your mother called me the maid who sleeps with you," I'd said, my voice shaking with fury and hurt. "Your sister refers to me as the help in family group chats. Your father has never once acknowledged my career or achievements. And you, my husband, the person who's supposed to be on my side. You've been participating in all of it. You've been agreeing with them, making jokes about me, treating me like I'm an employee who's failing to meet performance standards. That's not high standards." Marcus had tried to hug me, to systematic dehumanization disguised the way he usually did when we fought. But I'd pulled away, unable to bear the touch of someone who'd been betraying me so thoroughly for so long. He'd promised to do better, to set boundaries with his family, to make changes. But I'd heard all those promises before, hundreds of times over 3 years, and nothing had ever actually changed. The Montgomerys would push, I'd resist, Marcus would promise to fix things, and then we'd slide right back into the same patterns with me serving and them taking and nobody acknowledging the fundamental inequality of the arrangement. That fight had planted a seed of something dangerous in my mind, the possibility of leaving. For the first time in our marriage, I'd looked at Marcus and seriously considered whether life without him might actually be better than life with him. I'd imagined what it would be like to have my Sundays back, to make plans without consulting the Montgomery family social calendar, to pursue my career without constantly being interrupted by someone else's emergency. The fantasy had been so compelling, so seductive, that it had scared me. I wasn't ready to give up on my marriage. I still believed that Marcus could change, that we could fix what had broken between us. I'd been desperately, pathetically wrong. The month leading up to that catastrophic brunch had been tense and fragile. Like walking on glass while pretending everything was fine. Marcus had made some token efforts at improvement. He'd told his mother we couldn't host Sunday dinner one week, though he'd framed it as both of us being busy rather than me being burned out. He'd hired a cleaning service to come by weekly, which had helped but also made Patricia comment on how nice it must be to outsource household duties instead of taking pride in maintaining your own home. He'd even suggested we take a vacation, just the two of us, though he'd immediately undermined it by proposing we visit his cousin in the Hamptons for a relaxing family weekend, but the fundamental dynamic hadn't changed because Marcus hadn't actually changed. He was still checking his family group chat constantly. He was still prioritizing his mother's calls over our conversations. He was still expecting me to handle all the emotional labor and household management while he focused on his career. The only difference was that now he was aware I was unhappy about it, which made him slightly more defensive and apologetic but not actually motivated to do things differently. Then had come Patricia's announcement that she wanted to do a special family brunch to celebrate Marcus's promotion properly, with just the immediate family at the country club. Marcus had framed it as a nice gesture, a chance for his family to honor him in a more intimate setting than the big party. I'd agreed to go because by that point I was too exhausted to fight about every single family obligation. I'd bought a new dress, a designer piece I'd charged to our credit card without looking at the price tag because I was beyond caring about money I'd never get to spend on things I actually wanted. I'd even made myself believe that maybe this would be different, that maybe Patricia actually wanted to celebrate her son without using me as unpaid event staff. I should have known better. I should have recognized the setup the moment we arrived and Patricia had a server bring me an apron along with everyone else's mimosas. She'd smiled that terrifying smile and said, "I thought you wouldn't mind helping serve. Dear. You're so good at it, and the servers are overwhelmed today." It had been a test, right there in public, to see if I'd comply with being reduced to serving staff at my own husband's celebration. And because I was still trying to keep the peace, still desperately hoping to be accepted by these people who would never accept me, I'd put on that damn apron and started distributing bread baskets and refilling water glasses while the Montgomery family sat at the table discussing Marcus's brilliant career, but something had shifted in me during that service. Maybe it was the way Vanessa had snapped her fingers at me to get my attention when she wanted more butter. Maybe it was the way Richard had handed me his dirty napkin without even looking at my face. Maybe it was the way Marcus had let all of it happen without a single word of protest. Whatever the trigger, I'd felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest, a core of anger that I'd been suppressing for 3 solid years finally solidifying into something undeniable. I'd taken off the apron and sat down at the table just as the main course was arriving. Patricia had frowned, clearly displeased that I was abandoning my serving duties, but I'd ignored her and picked up the menu to order my own meal. The table had fallen into awkward silence, the Montgomerys exchanging glances that communicated their shared disapproval of my unexpected assertion of personhood. Marcus had put his hand on my knee under the table. A warning or perhaps a plea for me to stop whatever I was doing and return to my assigned role. I'd moved my leg away from his touch, "So, Marcus," I'd said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Tell us about your promotion. What does being senior partner actually mean in terms of responsibilities and decision-making power?" It was a perfectly innocent question, the kind of thing a supportive spouse would ask. But Patricia had stiffened because she recognized that I was claiming space in the conversation, asserting my right to participate rather than simply facilitate. Marcus had launched into an explanation of his new role, but he'd kept glancing at his mother. Looking for permission or approval or maybe just reassurance that everything was still under control, I'd continued asking questions, engaging Marcus in an actual conversation about his work, his goals, his challenges. Every time someone tried to redirect the discussion or change the subject, I'd steered it back to Marcus and his career. It was his celebration, after all. Shouldn't we actually be talking about him rather than about Patricia's upcoming charity gala or Vanessa's redecorating project or Richard's golf game? The Montgomerys had grown increasingly uncomfortable with this bizarre behavior from the help, this unprecedented act of participating in family conversation like I was actually family. That's when Patricia had decided to reassert control. She'd smiled that smile, the one that meant someone was about to be put firmly in their place, and addressed me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "Rachel, dear, I've been meaning to talk to you about Thanksgiving planning. I know it's still a few months away, but these things require so much advance coordination. I was thinking we'd do it at your place again this year, since you've gotten so good at hosting the family gatherings. Maybe 30 guests this time. I'll send you the menu I'd like you to prepare, 30 guests." She wanted me to cook Thanksgiving dinner for 30 people, in our apartment that could barely fit 15 comfortably. Using recipes she'd select and approve. I'd opened my mouth to refuse, to finally set a boundary after 3 years of being boundaryless, when Marcus had jumped in with his answer. "That sounds great, Mom. Rachel loves hosting Thanksgiving. Don't you, honey?" He'd looked at me with pleading eyes, silently begging me not to embarrass him in front of his family by refusing his mother's request, and that's when I'd felt the final thread of my patience snap. I'd looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and seen not a partner but a coward. A man who'd rather sacrifice his wife's sanity than risk his mother's disapproval. A man who'd been actively participating in my dehumanization while pretending to be supportive in private. A man who'd promised to forsake all others and cleave only unto me, but who'd never actually left his family's control long enough to build a real marriage. "Actually, no," I'd said, my voice clear and firm. "I don't love hosting Thanksgiving. I don't love spending weeks planning meals that everyone criticizes. I don't love sacrificing every holiday to the Montgomery family schedule. I don't love being treated like hired help who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. So no, Patricia, we will not be hosting Thanksgiving at our place this year. In fact, we won't be hosting any family gatherings at our place anymore." The silence that fell over the table was deafening. I could hear the ambient noise of the country club around us. Other diners chatting and laughing, the clink of silverware on china, the soft background music. But at our table, nobody moved or spoke. They were all staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult or renouncing civilization or doing something equally unthinkable. Richard's face had gone red. Vanessa's mouth was hanging open in shock. Marcus looked like he might actually faint. And Patricia had narrowed her eyes with an expression of pure calculation. "I see," Patricia had said slowly, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "Marcus, I think your wife is having some kind of episode. Perhaps the stress of your promotion has been too much for her. It happens with people who aren't accustomed to our level of responsibility." She'd said it so reasonably, so calmly, with just the right amount of concerned compassion to make it sound like she was worried about my mental health rather than insulting my character and background, and that's when Vanessa had decided to pile on. "Mom's right. Rachel, nobody is forcing you to host anything. We're family. Family helps each other. That's what normal people do. Maybe you're just not used to being part of a real family. Coming from your background." The implications in "your background" had been crystal clear. Poor people, immigrants, people who didn't grow up with country club memberships and trust funds, we apparently didn't understand the concept of family loyalty or mutual support. I'd felt something hot and powerful rising in my chest, years of swallowed anger finally finding its voice. "My background?" I'd said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You mean the background where I worked 3 jobs to pay for college? Where I earned my law degree without a legacy admission? Where I made partner track at my firm based on merit instead of having my name already on the building? That background? The one where family actually means supporting each other instead of exploiting whoever is too nice to say no." Richard had started to interrupt, to deliver one of his speeches about Montgomery family values, but I'd held up my hand to stop him. "No. For 3 years I've listened to lectures about family responsibility and proper behavior and appropriate standards. For 3 years I've nodded and smiled and tried to meet expectations that were designed to be impossible to meet. For 3 years I've worked as your unpaid event planner, personal assistant, household manager, and general servant while maintaining a full-time career and pretending that all of this was normal. But I'm done pretending. I'd pulled out my phone and opened the spreadsheet I'd been keeping, the one that documented every obligation. Every event, every moment of unpaid labor. Since marrying Marcus, I have spent 2,847 hours working for this family. That's 118 full days. Almost 4 months of my life. If you'd hired professionals to provide the services I've been giving you for free, it would have cost you $85,000. But you didn't hire professionals. You found someone desperate enough for acceptance that she'd work for free. Congratulations on that excellent return on investment. The numbers had an effect that my words alone couldn't achieve. Even the Montgomerys, who communicated primarily through subtle implications and passive aggression, couldn't ignore hard data displayed on a screen. Patricia had gone very still, her social smile finally cracking around the edges. Richard had started to bluster about how I was being inappropriate and dramatic. Vanessa had checked her own phone, as if she could fact-check my lived experience on Google. And Marcus had reached for my hand again, trying to make me stop talking, stop exposing the family's dysfunction to public scrutiny, but I'd moved my hand away from him and continued. Do you know what I discovered last month? There's a family group chat that I'm not part of. A chat where you all refer to me as the help. Where you make jokes about my education, my family, my inability to meet your impossible standards. And Marcus, my husband, participates in all of it. He agrees when you criticize me. He makes his own jokes about how I'm still learning to adjust to your standards. He treats me like a probationary employee in private the same way you all treat me like a servant in public. That revelation had made even Patricia look uncomfortable. The game worked best when everyone pretended it wasn't a game, when the exploitation remained unspoken and deniable. By putting it into words, by showing them evidence of their own cruelty reflected back at them, I'd violated the fundamental rule of their system. We were supposed to maintain the fiction that they were gracious hosts and I was a beloved family member. Not acknowledge the reality that they were exploiters and I was their victim. Marcus had tried to grab my phone, actually lunged across the table to take it from my hands, but I'd pulled it away from his reach. Don't, I'd said, and something in my voice must have warned him that I was well past the point of being managed or controlled because he'd frozen in place. Don't you dare try to hide the evidence of what you've been doing to me. Don't you dare gaslight me into thinking this is all in my head or that I'm being too sensitive. I have proof. Years of proof. And if you try to take it from me, I will make copies and send them to everyone in your professional network so they can see exactly what kind of man you really are. The threat had been real and he'd known it. I could see him calculating the damage to his reputation, his career, his standing in the legal community if people knew he'd spent 3 years systematically dehumanizing his wife while projecting an image of the perfect marriage. The Montgomerys' power came from their carefully maintained image of respectability and success. Exposing the ugliness beneath that image would have consequences they couldn't easily contain. Richard had decided to try a different approach, switching from bluster to paternalistic concern. Rachel, I think you need to calm down and think about what you're saying. You're obviously under a lot of stress. Maybe you should take some time off work. See a therapist, get some help managing your emotions. We're all family here. There's no need for this kind of hostile behavior. The gaslighting was so textbook it would have been funny if it hadn't been so enraging. I was the problem. My reaction to being exploited was the issue, not the exploitation itself, but Vanessa had been the one to finally say the quiet part out loud. She'd set down her mimosa and looked directly at me with something like pity mixed with contempt. Rachel, you need to understand something. You married into a family with certain standards and expectations. We have a way of doing things that's worked for generations. If you're not willing or able to adapt to our family culture, maybe you need to reconsider whether you're really suited to be a Montgomery wife. We're trying to help you fit in, but you have to meet us halfway. You can't expect us to lower our standards just because you're struggling to meet them," and that's when Patricia had delivered the killing blow. She'd reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that was meant to look maternal but felt condescending and dismissive. "You're just the maid who happens to sleep with my son, dear. Know your place." She'd said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if she was just stating an obvious truth that everyone at the table already understood. "We've welcomed you into our family, given you opportunities and access to our social circle that you never would have had otherwise. The least you can do is show some gratitude and pull your weight. If that's too much for you to handle, well, there are plenty of other women who would be more than happy to take your place." The words had hung in the air for a moment, suspended in the shocked silence of the other diners who'd stopped their own conversations to watch our family drama unfold. Patricia had said it loudly enough for the entire terrace to hear, a public declaration of my status in the Montgomery family hierarchy. I'd looked around at the faces surrounding us, seeing curiosity, sympathy, embarrassment, and in a few cases, recognition. I wasn't the first woman to be treated this way by her wealthy in-laws. Just the first one at this particular club on this particular day to have it stated so explicitly. I turned back to look at Marcus, giving him one last chance to defend me, to tell his mother she was out of line, to act like my husband instead of her son. But Marcus had just sat there, his face red and his eyes downcast, saying nothing. His silence was louder than any words could have been. He'd made his choice, and it wasn't me. It had never been me. I'd been a temporary fantasy, a brief rebellion against his family's expectations, but when push came to shove, he'd always choose the Montgomerys over me. I'd just been too blind or too hopeful or too desperate to see it before this moment. I'd stood up from the table, slowly and deliberately, making sure everyone on that terrace could see what happened next. I'd reached down and untied the apron I'd been wearing, the one Patricia had handed me when we'd arrived, the one that symbolized my role as the family servant. I'd folded it carefully, taking my time, letting the moment stretch until the tension was almost unbearable. And then I'd dropped it directly into Patricia's lap, right on top of her designer dress and her Cartier bracelet in her perfectly manicured hands. "Then I quit," I'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Effective immediately. You can find someone else to be your unpaid staff member. I'm sure there are plenty of other women who'd be happy to sacrifice their careers, their identity, and their self-respect for the privilege of serving the Montgomery family. But I'm done. I'm done hosting your dinners and planning your parties and organizing your charity events. I'm done being invisible in my own life. I'm done being treated like a servant in the family I married into. And I'm especially done pretending that any of this is normal or acceptable or anything other than what it really is, exploitation disguised as family values." Patricia's face had gone through several interesting color changes, from her usual powdered pallor to a shade of red that probably wasn't healthy for someone her age. Vanessa had gasped dramatically, clutching her pearls like she was in a Victorian novel. Richard had started sputtering about disrespect and inappropriate behavior and how dare I speak to his wife that way. And Marcus had finally found his voice, standing up and grabbing my arm in a grip that would probably leave bruises. "Rachel, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing all of us. Just sit down and apologize to my mother right now," but I pulled my arm out of his grasp and stepped back from the table. "No, Marcus. I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm finally being honest about what this marriage really is. And what it really is over. You can have your family and their impossible standards and their group chat where you all mock me. I'm going back to our apartment to pack my things. You can explain to your mother why her favorite servant just gave notice." The walk through the country club to the exit had felt like moving through water, every step requiring conscious effort, every breath a small victory. I could feel eyes on me from every table, could hear the whispers starting to spread through the dining room as people processed what they'd just witnessed. The Montgomery family scandal was going to be the talk of the club for weeks. Maybe months. Patricia would be mortified, her carefully cultivated image of the perfect family shattered by her daughter-in-law's very public resignation from servitude. Part of me felt guilty about causing such a scene, but a larger part felt exhilarated by finally speaking my truth after 3 years of silence. Marcus had followed me out to the parking lot, his voice taking on that pleading tone he used when he wanted to manipulate me into forgiveness without actually changing his behavior. "Rachel, please. Come back inside. We can work this out. You're just upset. You don't mean what you're saying. My family loves you. They don't think of you as a maid. That's ridiculous. Mom was just joking. You know how her humor can be sometimes. She didn't mean it the way it sounded." I'd stopped walking and turned to face him, really face him, for what I knew would probably be the last time. "Marcus, your mother called me a maid in front of an entire restaurant. She said I should know my place. And you sat there and said nothing. You didn't defend me. You didn't tell her she was wrong. You didn't even look surprised by what she said because that's exactly how you all see me. I'm not your wife. I'm your family's unpaid staff member who you occasionally sleep with. And I'm done accepting that role." He tried to take my hands, to pull me into a hug, to use physical affection to short-circuit my anger the way he always did. But I'd stepped back, keeping distance between us, maintaining the boundary I should have set 3 years ago. "We can go to counseling," he'd said desperately. "We can work on this. I'll set better boundaries with my family. I promise things will change. Just give me another chance. Don't throw away our marriage over one bad moment, one bad moment." 3 years of systematic exploitation reduced to one bad moment, like this was an isolated incident rather than the culmination of 1,000 small cruelties. "Marcus, I've been giving you chances for 3 years. Every time I complained about your family's treatment, you promised to do better. Every time I asked for support, you told me I was being too sensitive. Every time I tried to set a boundary, you guilt me into backing down. This isn't one bad moment. This is who you are and who your family is. And I'm finally accepting that you're never going to change." I'd gotten into my car, started the engine, and driven away while Marcus stood in the parking lot, probably already calling his mother to discuss how to handle his wife's nervous breakdown. Because that's how they'd frame it, I knew. Rachel had a meltdown. Rachel couldn't handle the pressure. Rachel wasn't strong enough or sophisticated enough or Montgomery enough to be part of their family. They'd never admit the truth, that they'd systematically dehumanized someone who'd loved them and tried to please them. And when that person finally had enough and fought back, they'd been shocked by the consequences of their own cruelty. The drive back to our apartment had been a blur of tears and rage and something that felt suspiciously like relief. I'd called Sophia, my best friend who'd been warning me about the Montgomery family since before the wedding, and she'd answered on the first ring. "I left him," I'd said, and then started crying too hard to explain anything else. Sophia had just listened to me sob, making occasional supportive noises, until I'd calmed down enough to give her the full story. When I'd finished, there had been a long pause before she spoke. "Rachel, I love you, and I'm proud of you for finally standing up for yourself," Sophia had said carefully. "But I have to ask, what took you so long? Because the rest of us have been watching this happen for 3 years, watching you disappear into that family's demands, and we've all been wondering when you'd finally have enough." Her words had stung because they were true. Everyone in my life except the Montgomerys had seen what was happening to me. My parents had gently expressed concern. My friends had made increasingly less subtle comments about how much I'd changed. My boss had tried to warn me about sacrificing my career for people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. But I'd dismissed all of them, convinced that I knew better, that my marriage was worth the effort. That love could overcome any obstacle. I'd spent the rest of that day packing my belongings while Marcus was presumably still at the country club doing damage control with his family. I'd sorted through 3 years of accumulated stuff, separating my clothes from his, my books from the ones the Montgomery family had given us, my personal items from the wedding gifts that had always felt more like theirs than ours. Every object told a story of compromise and accommodation, of me making myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me. The apartment had never felt like mine anyway, decorated according to Patricia's taste with furniture she'd selected and art she'd approved. Leaving it felt less like abandoning a home and more like escaping a museum where I'd been living as an exhibit. Sophia had arrived with a U-Haul and 3 other friends, women who'd watched my slow decline into Montgomery servitude and were clearly thrilled to be helping with my escape. We'd worked efficiently, loading boxes and furniture while sharing stories about the worst Montgomery family moments they'd witnessed. Sarah remembered the Christmas when Patricia had made me rewrap all the gifts because my corners weren't crisp enough. Jennifer recalled the dinner party where Vanessa had sent back 3 different appetizers I'd prepared because they weren't quite right. Maria had been at my wedding and heard Patricia's toast about me working hard to learn their ways. They'd all seen it, all known what was happening, and now they were helping me reclaim my life. By the time Marcus returned home that evening, the apartment was half empty and I was gone. I'd left my key on the kitchen counter along with a note that said simply, "I meant what I said. I want a divorce. Have your attorney contact mine." No explanations, no apologies, no opening for negotiation or reconciliation. I'd spent 3 years explaining and apologizing and negotiating, and it had gotten me nowhere except deeper into exploitation. This time, I was going to let my actions speak for themselves. I'd moved into Sophia's guest bedroom temporarily while I figured out my next steps. That first night of freedom, I'd slept for 12 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes from finally putting down a burden you've been carrying for too long. When I'd woken up, I'd felt lighter than I had in years. No Sunday dinner to plan. No family obligations to fulfill. No Patricia calling to complain about some minor social crisis that required my immediate attention. Just space and quiet and the possibility of rebuilding my life on my own terms. But the Montgomery family wasn't ready to let me go without a fight. The phone calls had started that very first day. Patricia leaving voicemails about how disappointed she was in my behavior, how I'd embarrassed the family. How Marcus was devastated by my abandonment. Vanessa sending texts about how selfish I was being, how I was destroying her brother's happiness, how I clearly never understood what it meant to be part of a real family. Even Richard had called, delivering a stern lecture about the sanctity of marriage vows and the importance of working through difficulties instead of running away like a child. And Marcus had been relentless. Multiple calls per day, long rambling voicemails that alternated between apologetic and accusatory. He was sorry for not defending me. He was angry that I'd humiliated his family. He wanted to work on our marriage. He couldn't believe I was giving up so easily. He'd change his behavior. I was overreacting. He loved me. I was being unreasonable. The messages revealed the same fundamental confusion that had characterized our entire marriage. Marcus genuinely couldn't understand why I was upset because he genuinely didn't see anything wrong with how his family had treated me. I'd blocked all their numbers after the first week and referred them to my attorney. Margaret Chen's friend Diana Wu, who specialized in high-asset divorces. Diana had listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard for the first time in years. When I'd finished, she'd smiled grimly and said, "We're going to make this very expensive for them. Not because we're vindictive, but because people like the Montgomerys only understand consequences when they hit the bank account. Your unpaid labor has value, and we're going to make sure they pay for it." Diana had filed for divorce on grounds of constructive abandonment, arguing that Marcus had failed to fulfill his basic marital obligations of respect, support, and partnership. She'd included my spreadsheet as evidence of the systematic exploitation I'd endured. Along with screenshots of the family group chat and testimony from friends who'd witnessed the Montgomery family's treatment of me. The filing had been aggressive and detailed, laying out 3 years of abuse disguised as family culture. When the Montgomery family's attorney received it, he'd apparently called Diana immediately to discuss settlement terms. They'd expected a quick, quiet divorce with standard asset division. They'd gotten a detailed indictment of their entire family dynamic instead, but the Montgomerys had decided to fight back, and they'd brought their considerable resources to bear on destroying my credibility. Their attorney had filed a response that painted me as an unstable, manipulative woman who'd married Marcus for his money and was now trying to extort the family after failing to meet basic standards of behavior. They'd claimed I'd been verbally and emotionally abusive to Patricia, that I'd isolated Marcus from his family, that I'd refused to contribute to household management despite not having my own career. Every accusation had been a twisted version of the truth, taking my legitimate complaints and reframing them as evidence of my dysfunction. The character assassination had extended beyond legal filings. Suddenly, stories had started circulating in the social circles we traveled in as a couple. Rachel had anger management problems. Rachel had been jealous of Marcus's success. Rachel had never fit in with the Montgomery family's values. Rachel had abandoned her husband over a simple misunderstanding. The Montgomery family's network of friends, colleagues, and social connections had become a propaganda machine designed to reshape the narrative from "wealthy family exploits daughter-in-law" to "unstable woman destroys good marriage." The worst had been the call from my boss at the firm. Margaret Chen had asked me to come to her office, and I'd known from her tone that something was wrong. When I'd arrived, she'd closed the door and looked at me with something like pity. "Rachel, I received a call from Richard Montgomery yesterday. He wanted to discuss your recent behavior and expressed concern about your stability. He suggested that you might be experiencing some kind of breakdown and that the firm should be aware of potential performance issues." The implication had been crystal clear. The Montgomerys were trying to sabotage my career the way they'd already sabotaged my marriage, but Margaret had been one step ahead of them. "I told Richard that I'd worked with you for 6 years and had never seen any evidence of instability or performance issues. I also told him that contacting someone's employer to spread rumors about their mental health was grounds for a harassment lawsuit. He backed off very quickly after that." She'd paused, studying my face. "Rachel, I've seen this pattern before with powerful families. They can't stand losing control, so they try to destroy anyone who escapes their influence. You need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." She'd been right. The Montgomery family's campaign had escalated in ways I never could have anticipated. Suddenly, my social media accounts had been flooded with messages from strangers calling me a gold digger, a social climber, and various other creative insults. Someone had created a fake profile using my name and photos, posting inflammatory content designed to damage my professional reputation. My parents had received anonymous calls warning them that their daughter was having a mental breakdown and needed help. Even my undergraduate alma mater had received a letter questioning whether I'd misrepresented my credentials during the admissions process. Diana had documented everything, building a case not just for divorce but for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. "They're making this easier for us," she'd explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Every time they try to attack you, they're creating more evidence of their pattern of abuse. Let them keep digging their own grave." But living through it had been excruciating. Every day brought new attacks, new lies, new attempts to destroy the reputation and career I'd spent years building. The Montgomerys had made it clear they'd rather burn everything down than admit they'd been wrong about how they'd treated me. The breaking point in the legal battle had come during the depositions. Marcus had been deposed first, and according to Diana, he'd been a terrible witness. He'd been defensive, contradictory, and unable to explain away the evidence of the family group chat or my documentation of unpaid labor. When Diana had asked him directly why he'd participated in mocking me in private while pretending to support me in public, he'd apparently stammered something about it being complicated family dynamics that I'd never understood. The deposition transcript had been a gift to our case, showing Marcus's inability to defend his actions without sounding cruel or oblivious. Patricia's deposition had been even more damaging. Diana had walked her through every event I'd planned. Every obligation I'd fulfilled, every moment of unpaid labor I'd provided to the Montgomery family. Patricia had tried to minimize everything, claiming that I'd volunteered for all of it, that family members helping each other was normal, that she'd never asked me to do anything I wasn't happy to do. But when Diana had played the recording from the country club brunch, Patricia's own voice declaring that I was just the maid who sleeps with my son, the deposition room had gone silent. Diana had leaned forward and asked the question that had destroyed Patricia's entire defense. "Mrs. Montgomery, if Rachel was a beloved daughter-in-law who was happily volunteering to help the family, why did you feel the need to remind her to know her place?" Patricia had tried to claim she'd been joking, that her words had been taken out of context, that I'd always been too sensitive about harmless family banter. But the recording was clear, and so was the intent behind her words. She'd been establishing hierarchy, making sure I understood that I would never be an equal member of the Montgomery family. The settlement negotiations had been brutal. The Montgomerys had initially offered me basically nothing, claiming I wasn't entitled to any of Marcus's assets because I'd abandoned the marriage. Diana had countered with a demand for compensation for my unpaid labor, emotional distress damages, and a significant portion of the marital assets given Marcus's breach of his obligations. We'd gone back and forth for weeks, each side making increasingly aggressive demands and counteroffers. The Montgomerys had tried to use my middle-class background against me, suggesting that I'd already benefited enormously from access to their social circle and should be grateful for the opportunities they'd provided, but Diana had been relentless. She'd threatened to make the case public, to release all the evidence of the Montgomery family's exploitation to the media outlets that loved nothing more than a story about wealthy families behaving badly. She'd pointed out that Marcus's position at the firm could be jeopardized if his colleagues and clients learned about his participation in systematic abuse. She'd made it clear that I was willing to fight this battle as long and as publicly as necessary to get justice. And slowly, finally, the Montgomerys had started to realize that I wasn't going to be intimidated or bought off cheaply. The final settlement had been more than I'd expected but less than I deserved. I'd received a significant cash payment representing partial compensation for my unpaid labor, plus a division of marital assets that left me financially secure. The Montgomerys had also been required to sign a non-disparagement agreement, legally prohibiting them from spreading lies about me or interfering with my career. In exchange, I'd agreed to confidentiality about the specific details of the settlement and the evidence we'd gathered. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was accountability, and after 3 years of having none, accountability felt like victory. The divorce had been finalized 6 months after that brunch at the country club. 6 months of legal battles, character assassination, and fighting for basic recognition of my humanity. 6 months of discovering exactly how vindictive wealthy families could be when their authority was challenged. But also 6 months of slowly reclaiming my identity, my career, and my sense of self-worth. I'd thrown myself back into work, taking on high-profile cases and remember what it felt like to be valued for my skills rather than my service. Margaret had been supportive throughout, adjusting my workload when I needed space and pushing me to excel when I needed challenge. The day the divorce was finalized, I'd gone out to dinner with Sophia and my other friends who'd helped me escape the Montgomery apartment. We'd celebrated my freedom with expensive wine and mediocre Italian food, laughing about the absurdity of how much of my life I'd wasted trying to earn the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. To Rachel, Sophia had toasted, raising her glass. Who finally remembered she's worth more than being someone's unpaid maid. We'd all drunk to that, and for the first time in years, I'd felt like myself again, but the real satisfaction had come a few months later when I'd run into Vanessa at a professional conference. She'd been there with her husband, both of them working the room and networking with the kind of desperate energy that suggested their social status wasn't as secure as it had once been. When she'd seen me, her face had gone through several interesting expressions, settling on a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rachel," she'd said, her voice overly bright. "How nice to see you. How have you been?" I'd smiled back, genuine warmth because I no longer had any reason to care what Vanessa Montgomery thought of me. "I've been excellent, actually. I made partner at my firm last month. How are things with you?" The question had been sincere, but Vanessa had taken it as some kind of attack, her smile faltering as she'd realized that I'd thrived after leaving her family. "Oh, we're fine. Everything's fine. Marcus is doing well at the firm. He's seeing someone new, actually. Someone much more suited to our family's lifestyle." The dig had been obvious, but it had bounced off me harmlessly because I genuinely didn't care who Marcus was dating or whether his new girlfriend was willing to play maid for the Montgomery family. "That's great," I'd said sincerely. "I hope she's better at managing your mother's impossible expectations than I was. Good luck to her." I'd walked away before Vanessa could respond, leaving her standing there with her fake smile and her defensive posture, probably wondering why her attempt to make me jealous had failed so spectacularly. The truth was, finding out Marcus had moved on had been a relief rather than a hurt. It meant he was someone else's problem now. And I was free to build a life that actually belonged to me. That life had been emerging slowly but steadily over the months since the divorce. I'd bought a small condo in the city, decorating it according to my own taste without any input from people who thought they knew better. I'd reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage, rebuilding relationships that had suffered from my constant availability to the Montgomery family. I'd started dating casually, nothing serious, just remembering what it felt like to be treated with basic respect and consideration by men who saw me as a person rather than a service provider. Most importantly, I'd rediscovered who I was outside of my role as Marcus's wife and the Montgomery family's servant. I'd remembered that I was a skilled attorney who'd earned her position through talent and hard work. I was a good friend who showed up for people who showed up for me. I was someone with interests and opinions and boundaries, none of which required approval from people who'd never respected me anyway. The Rachel Torres who'd walked out of that country club 6 months ago had been broken and exhausted. The Rachel Torres who'd emerged from the divorce was stronger, clearer, and completely done with accepting less than she deserved. I'd even started doing some pro bono work for women going through divorces from wealthy, abusive families. Diana had connected me with several clients who were fighting battles similar to mine. Women who'd been systematically exploited and then gaslit into thinking they were the problem. I'd shared my story, offered my experience, and helped them understand that they weren't crazy for feeling like they'd been used. There was something deeply satisfying about using the worst experience of my life to help other women escape similar situations. The Montgomerys had tried to destroy me, but instead they'd created someone who understood their tactics and could help others resist them. About a year after the divorce, I'd received an unexpected email from Marcus. It had been short and carefully worded, probably reviewed by his attorney before sending. He'd wanted to apologize for how things had ended. For not standing up to his family, for participating in behavior that he now recognized as unacceptable. He'd claimed that losing me had forced him to examine his family's dynamics and his own complicity in them. He'd said he'd been in therapy, working on setting boundaries with his parents, trying to become the man he'd always thought he was but had never actually been. The email had ended with a request to meet for coffee, to talk about what had happened, maybe to find some closure. I'd stared at that email for a long time, thinking about the man I'd married and the marriage I'd fought so hard to save. Part of me had wanted to believe that Marcus had genuinely changed, that my leaving had been the wake-up call he'd needed to break free from his family's toxic influence. But a larger, wiser part of me knew that Marcus's change, if it was even real, wasn't my responsibility or my concern anymore. I'd spent 3 years trying to fix our marriage while he'd sat passively by and let his family destroy me. His personal growth journey, however sincere, didn't require my participation or forgiveness. I'd written back a brief response: Marcus, I appreciate the apology, but I'm not interested in meeting. What happened between us wasn't a misunderstanding that can be resolved over coffee. It was a pattern of behavior that revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our values and priorities. I hope you're working on yourself for your own sake and for whoever you're with next. But I've moved on, and I think it's best if we both keep moving forward separately. Take care of yourself. I'd hit send and then blocked his email address, closing that final door on a chapter of my life that had taught me everything I needed to know about standing up for myself. The real closure had come not from Marcus's apology but from my own growing understanding of what had happened and why. I'd spent some time in therapy myself, working through the anger and grief and residual guilt about how things had ended. My therapist had helped me see that the Montgomery family's exploitation hadn't happened in a vacuum. They'd specifically chosen someone like me, someone with less social capital and fewer resources. Someone who'd be grateful for access to their world and willing to work hard to maintain that access. They'd seen my ambition and my work ethic and my desire to belong, and they'd weaponized all of it against me, but I'd also had to acknowledge my own role in what had happened. I'd ignored red flags. I'd accepted unacceptable behavior. I'd convinced myself that love and effort could overcome structural inequality in a relationship. I'd wanted so badly to be accepted by Marcus's family that I'd sacrificed pieces of myself, one compromise at a time, until I'd nearly disappeared completely. The Montgomerys had been cruel, but I'd allowed that cruelty by not setting boundaries, by not walking away sooner, by not valuing myself enough to demand better treatment. Understanding that had been painful but ultimately liberating because it meant I had the power to make different choices in the future. Those different choices had led me to where I was now, 2 years after that catastrophic brunch. I was a partner at my firm, specializing in complex corporate litigation. I had a close circle of friends who actually valued my company rather than my services. I was dating a fellow attorney who split bills, made his own travel plans, and had never once expected me to host dinner for his family. My parents were proud of me, not just for my career success but for having the courage to leave a marriage that was destroying me. I had a life that actually felt like mine, full of choices I'd made for myself rather than obligations I'd accepted to please other people. I'd also become something of an advocate for talking about financial and labor exploitation in marriages. I'd given a few talks at women's legal organizations about recognizing the signs of systematic abuse disguised as family culture. I'd written an article for a legal journal about the need to recognize unpaid domestic labor in divorce proceedings. I'd even been interviewed for a podcast about power dynamics in relationships, where one partner comes from significant wealth. The Montgomerys had tried to silence me with their settlement agreement, but I'd found ways to tell my story without violating the confidentiality clause, speaking in general terms about patterns that applied to many situations beyond my own. And then, exactly 2 years after that brunch, I'd gotten a voice message that had made me laugh out loud. It had been from Patricia Montgomery, her voice carefully controlled but with an edge of desperation underneath the polite words. "Rachel, dear, I hope you're well. I'm calling because we're having some difficulties with the planning for Marcus's engagement party. His fiancée Sarah is lovely but not very experienced with large events. And I was hoping you might be willing to offer some advice. Perhaps we could meet for lunch to discuss. I'd be happy to compensate you for your time." Of course, the irony had been almost too perfect. Patricia Montgomery, who'd spent 3 years treating me like unpaid help, was now calling to hire me as actual paid help because her son's new fiancé wasn't willing to work for free. I'd let the message sit for a few days, enjoying the knowledge that the Montgomerys were struggling without someone to exploit. Then I'd sent a brief text: "Patricia, I appreciate the offer, but I'm no longer available for event planning services. I'm sure you'll find someone else who's willing to help. There are several excellent professional event coordinators in the area who I'd be happy to recommend. Their rates are quite reasonable, probably around $85,000 for the level of service you require." The $85,000 reference had been deliberate, the exact amount of unpaid labor I'd calculated during my marriage. I'd wanted Patricia to know that I remembered, that I understood the value of what she'd taken from me, and that those days of free service were permanently over. She hadn't responded, which was fine. I didn't need her acknowledgement or apology. I just needed her to understand that I was no longer accessible to the Montgomery family in any capacity, professional or personal. Sarah, Marcus's new fiancée, had actually reached out to me separately a few weeks later. She'd sent a careful, respectful email explaining that she'd heard about me from mutual acquaintances and wanted to ask my advice about navigating the Montgomery family's expectations. I'd agreed to meet her for coffee, curious about who Marcus had chosen to replace me and whether she'd be any better at managing the family than I had been. When I'd met her, I'd been surprised to discover that Sarah was from old money herself, daughter of a family with even more social standing than the Montgomerys. She'd been polite, intelligent, and refreshingly direct about why she'd wanted to talk to me. "I'm not going to be anyone's maid," Sarah had said bluntly, stirring sugar into her latte. "Marcus told me about your marriage and what happened. He framed it as you being unable to handle his family's expectations, but I did some research and talked to people who actually knew you. I figured out pretty quickly that his family's expectations were actually systematic exploitation. I wanted to meet you to understand what I'm walking into and to learn from your experience." I'd liked her immediately. She'd been smart enough to investigate rather than just accepting Marcus's version of events, confident enough to reach out to his ex-wife directly, and clear-eyed enough to recognize potential problems before they became patterns. I'd spent 2 hours sharing everything I'd learned about the Montgomery family dynamics, the warning signs I'd missed, the boundaries I should have set from the beginning. Sarah had listened carefully, asking intelligent questions and taking actual notes. When we'd finished, she'd thanked me sincerely and said something that had stuck with me: "Rachel, what happened to you was terrible, and I'm sorry you went through it. But I want you to know that it wasn't wasted. Everything you learned, every boundary you wish you'd set, every warning sign you didn't recognize until too late, all of that is going to help me protect myself. Your experience is going to prevent the same thing from happening to me." That's not nothing. She'd been right. There was something redemptive about knowing that my painful experience could serve as a roadmap for someone else, helping them avoid the mistakes I'd made. Sarah and I had stayed in occasional contact after that meeting. She'd update me occasionally on her negotiations with the Montgomery family, laughing about Patricia's attempts to assign her domestic duties and her own firm refusals. She'd set boundaries from the beginning that I'd never managed to establish, making it clear that she had her own career, her own social obligations, and her own family to prioritize. She'd refused to host weekly family dinners, suggested professional catering for major events, and had no problem telling Patricia when her expectations were unreasonable. The Montgomerys, faced with someone from their own social class who understood and could navigate their power plays, had been forced to treat Sarah with the respect they'd never given me. Watching Sarah successfully manage the situation I'd failed to navigate had been bittersweet. Part of me had felt vindicated that it was possible to set boundaries with the Montgomerys if you came from the right background and had the right resources. But another part had grieved for who I'd been 3 years ago, that hopeful young attorney who believed that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. I'd learned the hard way that some obstacles aren't meant to be overcome. They're meant to be recognized as deal breakers and walked away from. The Montgomerys' fundamental disrespect for people they considered beneath them wasn't something that could be fixed with better communication or firmer boundaries. It was a core value, a bedrock belief in their own superiority that would never change regardless of how much effort their victims put into earning acceptance. But I'd also realized that my experience with the Montgomerys had taught me something invaluable about myself and what I needed in relationships. I'd learned that I had a tendency to overgive, to sacrifice my own needs in pursuit of belonging and acceptance. I'd learned that I needed to pay attention to early warning signs instead of dismissing them as minor issues that would resolve themselves. I'd learned that love without respect was just exploitation with better packaging. And most importantly, I'd learned that I had the strength to walk away from situations that weren't serving me, even when that meant disappointing people or facing social consequences or starting over from scratch. Those lessons had informed every aspect of my life since the divorce. In my career, I'd stopped taking on extra work to prove myself worthy of respect and had started demanding the recognition and compensation I'd earned. In my friendships, I'd let go of relationships that felt one-sided and invested energy in people who reciprocated my care and attention. In my dating life, I'd paid close attention to how potential partners treated service workers, talked about their families, and divided household labor in their own lives. I'd become almost allergic to signs of entitlement or expectation that I should serve rather than partner. Now, 3 years after walking out of that country club and 2 years after finalizing my divorce, I was in a relationship with someone who actually understood the concept of partnership. David was a public interest lawyer who'd grown up in a working-class family similar to mine. He cooked half the time, cleaned up after himself, and had never once suggested that planning his family's gatherings should be my responsibility. When we'd had Thanksgiving at his parents' house, I'd offered to help in the kitchen and his mother had actually shooed me out, saying, "You're a guest, honey, go relax with everyone else." The contrast with the Montgomery family had been so stark it had almost made me cry. David knew my full story with the Montgomerys. I'd told him everything on our 4th date, figuring it was better to scare him off early if he had any secret expectations about traditional gender roles or domestic servitude. Instead, he'd listened with growing anger, asked intelligent questions about why Marcus had been such a coward, and said something I'd never heard from a partner before: "That must have been incredibly lonely, being married to someone who never chose you over his family's dysfunction. I'm sorry you went through that. And I'm glad you got out before you lost yourself completely. He'd seen me, not as a resource to be exploited or a project to be fixed, but as a person who'd survived something difficult and come out stronger. We'd been together for 8 months now, and I was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for David to reveal some hidden expectation that I should shrink myself to fit his needs. But it hadn't happened. We made decisions together. We supported each other's careers. We divided labor based on who had time and interest rather than gender or family expectations. When his mother had birthday coming up, he'd planned the celebration himself and had genuinely seemed confused when I'd asked if he wanted my help. "She's my mom," he'd said simply. "Why would planning her party be your job?" That simple question had encapsulated everything that had been wrong with my marriage to Marcus and everything that was right about my relationship with David. I'd also rebuilt my relationship with my own family, which had suffered during my years with the Montgomerys. I'd been so busy trying to impress Marcus's family that I'd neglected my own parents, canceling visits when Patricia needed something, skipping family gatherings to attend Montgomery events, always prioritizing the people who gave me nothing over the people who'd given me everything. My father had been hurt by my distance but had never said anything, understanding that I was trying to navigate an impossible situation. My mother had been more direct, telling me that the Montgomerys didn't deserve me and that I should come home before I forgot where I came from, after the divorce. I'd gone home to Queens and spent a weekend with my parents, helping my father in his shop and cooking with my mother in the tiny kitchen where I'd learned to make arroz con pollo. We'd talked about everything that had happened, and my mother had said something that had shifted my entire perspective. "Mija, you thought you had to earn their love by serving them. But people who require service to show love aren't capable of actually loving anyone. They can only consume. You can't fill a hole that deep, no matter how much you give. The only winning move is not to play their game." She'd been absolutely right. The Montgomerys' game had been rigged from the start, designed to ensure I'd always be trying and failing to meet impossible standards. The only way to win had been to stop playing, to walk away and build a life according to my own rules rather than their arbitrary expectations. And that's exactly what I'd done. I'd stopped trying to earn acceptance from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it, and I'd started building relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Looking back now, I could see that the worst moment of my life, that public humiliation at the country club, had actually been the beginning of my liberation. Patricia's cruel words had finally stripped away all the illusions I'd been maintaining about my marriage and my place in the Montgomery family. She'd said out loud what they'd all been thinking, and in doing so, she'd given me permission to stop trying to prove myself to people who would never see me as anything more than convenient help. Her cruelty had been clarifying, cutting through years of gaslighting and subtle manipulation to reveal the ugly truth underneath, and I'd responded by reclaiming my agency and my identity, by refusing to accept the role they'd assigned me, by walking away from a situation that was literally making me smaller and less capable with every passing day. The Rachel Torres who'd sat at that table in her designer dress and her servant's apron had been a shadow of who I'd once been. The Rachel Torres who'd stood up and dropped that apron in Patricia's lap had been the real me. Finally fighting back after 3 years of being systematically diminished, the aftermath had been brutal, the divorce had been expensive and emotionally devastating, and the process of rebuilding my life had required more strength than I'd known I possessed. But I'd done it. I'd survived the Montgomery family's best attempts to destroy me, and I'd come out the other side stronger, clearer, and completely unwilling to ever accept that kind of treatment again. I'd learned to value myself enough to walk away from situations that didn't serve me, even when walking away meant disappointing people or facing uncertain futures, and now, 3 years later, I had a life I'd built on my own terms. A career I'd earned through talent and hard work. Relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocal care. A partner who saw me as an equal rather than a resource. A clear sense of my own worth that didn't require external validation from people who would never give it. The Montgomerys had tried to break me, to reduce me to a servant who should be grateful for access to their superior world. Instead, they'd taught me that their world wasn't superior at all, just expensive and empty and built on the exploitation of people they considered beneath them, I still thought about that moment sometimes, Patricia's voice cutting through the country club air like a knife. You're just the maid who happens to sleep with my son. Dear. Know your place. And I smiled every time I remembered it, not because it didn't hurt anymore, but because I'd finally found my place, and it was nowhere near the Montgomery family or anyone like them. My place was in a life I'd built for myself, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, working at a career I'd earned rather than married into, making choices based on my own priorities rather than someone else's impossible expectations. That was my place. And I'd never let anyone make me forget it again.